Good afternoon, friends. And thank you for being here with us. We were a bit anxious that given that this is a contemporary art session, we might find only about 5 or 10 people. So it's very encouraging to see so many of you. May I request those at the back to please move forward? So we are going to speak about Frances Morris's remarkable journey to becoming the only woman director among the 10 top museums in the world by attendance. Yes, and so Frances started at the Tate in 1987 and had come to it after studying at King's College in Cambridge and at the Courtauld Institute. And along with Nick Sirota, who has a similar background, also was at Cambridge and at the Courtauld, was responsible for reshaping and redefining the way contemporary art has been received, presented, and perceived across the world. In a sense, they were responsible, and in particular Frances, in wresting the baton, in a sense, from the MoMA in New York, if I may say that, and the challenging or redefining and relooking at the way the old school, Alfred Barr school, had presented modern art history. Frances was, in 2000, she became head of display and director of collections, and in 2000 was responsible, therefore, to represent, and I think she doesn't like the word thematize, but reorganize, in a sense, and represent the collections. Frances has been influenced, I think like many of us were when we were students in college, by Marxism. And I think she will talk to us about that, Frances, about whether that has helped to define your worldview and how you see the museum acting as a catalyst for social change. We're delighted to welcome you, Frances, and if you'd like to tell us about your journey and also a little bit about your vision and the Tate Modern.
Thank you, Tasneen. It's such a great pleasure to be here in Mumbai today. Can I just, before I start, can you hear what I'm saying? Because there's a bit of an echo up on the stage. What I thought I would do is really whiz through a presentation about the history of the Tate and the Tate now, and a number of the things that I say might provoke questions. But I'm a historian by trade, and therefore I love the historical context of the contemporary world. Just try and move this. So I'm just going to begin with this juxtaposition of two images, and this is a very sort of classic art historical methodology to show two works of art and to think about the comparisons between them. And the two works of art that I've chosen are a painting by Kandinsky, a famous Russian artist from the early part of the 20th century, and it's a painting called Cossacks. And it was a painting made on the brink of the Russian Revolution. And it's a picture which, although it has a subject matter drawn from the real world, a moment of uprising, political discontent, and social control, with the Cossacks rushing in to control the masses. It's also a painting where the artist is moving away from the real world and moving into abstraction. It was a moment in time in the early part of the 20th century where abstraction was born. And it's a moment in the history of Western art, the history of modernism, where ideas around sort of absolute beauty, the importance of color and form become part of what we call the canon of art history. And I've paired it with another work of art that doesn't look like a work of art at all. It looks like a political demonstration. two mounted policemen are trying to encourage a crowd of people into the corner. It's what we call kettling in the UK. It's how the police control citizens who are uprising on the streets. And it's made by a Cuban artist called Tania Bruguera. And essentially, it's dealing with the same subject matter as the abstract painting. But instead of retreating from the real world, this is a contemporary artist who is trying to move art into the real world and trying to work with audiences, people in the gallery, to give them a kind of direct engagement with a real-life experience. And I'm pairing these two because they represent either ends of the story of modern and contemporary art, and it's the story that the collection that I work with tells, and it's the story that you will find when you visit Tate Modern. Of course, Tate has a long history. Its history begins in the 18th century in the foundation of a prison. This is the first large-scale prison that was built in London on Millbank, on the side of the Thames. And it was a famous prison because it was one of the first prisons to adopt the structure and form of the panopticon, which was that idea of a central supervising body overseeing prisoners in all parts of the building. It was a prison that had 2.5 miles of corridors, it had 15,000 cells, and it was a proud pioneer of solitary confinement. It was also the prison from which many of the citizens of Britain were sent to Australia. And I like showing this because prisons and museums date from the same period in our history, and they have much in common. Museums like prisons, or prisons like museums, were designed to take things from the real world, lock them up in small rooms. The cell, after all, is the first white cube gallery, to protect them and look after them, to restrict access to them, and in direct opposite to the mission of the museum today, which is to draw people in, create access, put objects in a context. So the early years of the museum was very like the prison. And when I first went to Tate Gallery, and there it is, the old Tate in the 1980s, my job title was not curator, but it was keeper. And of course, keeper means the holder of the key and the guarder of the gate or the cell. So we've come a long way from those early days of the museum as prison, but it's a journey that has taken place really only over the last 20 years. I'm just going to show you very briefly a handwritten layout of our collection as it was installed in the 1990s in the old Tate Gallery at Millbank. And for those of you who know the history of art, can see, and this is in the hand of my director, Sir Nicholas Sirota, in the days when directors actually did do everything, a layout of the history of art which shows the narrative of British art moving into a narrative of American and European art. And nothing in that framework is from outside the kind of NATO bloc. It's a history that is a history of art purely in terms of painting and sculpture, and a few works on paper. So a history that did not acknowledge the existence of photography, of design, of architecture, of craft, of video or moving image. My own history at that time as keeper was as an exhibition maker, and I was very fortunate to make some great exhibitions in that gallery, but they were all like the collection of European and North American artists, and that's just catalogues of 4 exhibitions I made. One historic show of the 1950s, and then the rest of my practice was really about contemporary artist work. And then, of course, in 2000, we opened this Museum of Modern Art in a former power station on Bankside, on the other side of the Thames, opposite the City of London, in a very industrial area. And this was a piece of urban regeneration. And those of you who have visited London recently will see a neighbourhood that was poor, and working class and subsidiary now being a very vibrant cultural quarter. Tasneem mentioned the collection, and of course we installed the collection thematically. We dispensed with the idea of chronology, and we did it for a very, very simple reason, is we wanted to, by breaking the rules, show new aspects of the history of art. So kind of reframe, throw everything up in the air and see where it felt. And it was a fantastically interesting experience. And of course, what we learnt from that was that our collection had no photography, it had nothing beyond painting and sculpture, it had very few women in it, and it had no art from outside America and Northern Europe. So that was the map of the world that our collection demonstrated. But of course, this was a moment in time in 2000 where great art was being made all around the world. It was pre-Kochi, but we were already aware of extraordinary contemporary artists working actively in India, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America. So a real sense of a disjoint between our collection and art practice. So we began by exploring some of those more global stories in our exhibitions. And the catalogue in the middle there, Century City, was one of those landmark exhibitions where we not only showed contemporary art from around the world, but we looked back in time to cities like Mumbai, Lagos, Rio, and Tokyo, all of whom, like Paris, Moscow, New York, and London, had moments, decades of incredible cultural innovation. And it was a sort of statement to say global art is not just contemporary, but it has a history. And much of what we have done subsequently with the collection is to explore that complex history. And we have done it not in terms of a kind of conventional modernist narrative, but looking at other ways you might narrate history, through personal stories, through biography, through the way artists interact with each other, through dialogue, through migration, through network. So stories that take place in one country or that might play out over many countries. One of the artists in Century City was Atul Dodia, and this is a work I just wanted to share with you very quickly. It's a work we acquired not so long ago, in 2013, and it was only made in 2011, but Atul was in Century City, and this work for me encapsulates so much of how we collect art now. Atul is a contemporary Indian artist, and much of his references come from India and its history and his native Gujarat. But when he came to London for Century City in 2001, he encountered for the very first time the work of Piet Mondrian, an abstract artist from the Netherlands who's absolutely the center of the kind of modernist avant-garde story, pure abstraction. And Atul Dodia, encountering Mondrian's work in our galleries for the first time, without a huge sense of historical understanding, saw the surface of these paintings and saw the cracking in the surfaces of the old white and black. And it was just this moment in time when there were earthquakes back home in Gujarat. And he made this strong mental connection between the cracked surfaces of Mondrian's paintings and the cracked earth of his native country. And this work is full of references that take you on a journey between Gujarat and London, and Mumbai and London, Gandhi and Picasso, Louise Bourgeois, Henri Rousseau, Joseph Beuys. So a complex picture in a little personal museum about how history actually works. That it's not just the story of great events by great men, it's the story of context, social life, traveling, personal experience, chance, and so on and so forth. And for me, that's a kind of paradigm of how we now collect and tell the story of art. So we began to think about the way we were collecting contemporary artists and tried to think how they might connect with the past. So an artist like Miroslav Balka, important Polish artist now in his early 50s, a part of a kind of Eastern European flourishing of art after the wall came down in 1989. But when you look at his practice and many of the contemporary practitioners in Eastern Europe, of course, there are hidden histories and great artists who worked in the USSR and behind the Iron Curtain for many years undiscovered. They're not artists on the marketplace, but they're artists that you find out about when you ask younger artists who were their teachers. So an artist like Ana Lupaș, working in Romania, in the city of Cluj, in complete isolation for many years. And her work now is in the Tate Modern and part of that history. An artist like Magdalena Abakanowicz, who worked, for example, in Warsaw after the war and worked with fabric because she didn't have a studio. So she had nowhere to put paintings or sculptures, but if she worked in fabric, she could fold the work up and put it underneath her bed every night. Now, Magdalena Abakanowicz is part of a sort of secret history of women's work. And there are many female artists working in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were very profoundly influenced by Magdalena Abakanowicz. And they include Lenore Tawney, remarkable weaver from New York. And of course, they include Marlene Mukherjee. Marlene was an artist I met in Delhi on my visit 5 years ago. And I asked her about who were her influences. And one of the first names she mentioned was Magdalena Abakanowicz from Warsaw. So there you see a fantastic history that links Delhi to Warsaw, but exists completely outside the history books on the history of art. Of course, Marlene Mukherjee's father was Binod Mukherjee, and he was a distinguished mural painter and mosaic maker, and late in life, as his eyesight was failing, he took to paper collage. And this is a group of works that we have on display at Tate Modern at the moment, and we showed them in a room next door to our own fantastic, incredibly well-known collage by Henri Matisse. So there too is another historical connection, and whether it's zeitgeist or real connection, I don't know, but these works speak to each other. When we opened Tate Modern in June, for the first time since I've worked at Tate, contemporary art and what we've done had a huge impact on the press. For many years, much of what we've done has been met with derision and criticism, but there was something about this new building and the way we had hung a very international selection of artists that crosses media seemed to fit with the spirit in the UK and this really dreadful atmosphere of Brexit versus Remain. And the message of Tate Modern is that London is open and that London is a place, or Tate Modern is a place where races and nations and ethnicities and languages can speak together. A couple of pictures of the interior of the building, and the collection now speaks to this much broader geography. I'm going to whiz on a little bit so that we can get to questions. This is another work I wanted to show you by the Bangalore-based Sheila Gowda, and it's a beautiful work, extraordinary and compelling installation made out of human hair and car bumpers. And I love this work because it seems to me to speak of modernity and the contemporary world. It's impossible to visit India without encountering car bumpers wherever you go. The street, the city is full of mechanized transport, but everywhere also is this sense of tradition, of folklore, of superstition and religion, and the hair worn on the bumpers as a talisman against fear seems to speak to those traditions. And of course, Sheila Gowda's work is a work that many people find difficult to understand. Is it a work of art? How can this be car bumpers and human hair? And there are other works in the same area of display at Tate Modern. I've shown you this fantastic tapestry by the Lagos-based African artist El Anatsui, and it's a beautiful shimmering cloth made out of bottle tops that have been beaten flat and sewn together, but have this wonderful kind of iridescence. Both these works, both the Gowda and El Anatsui, of course, draw on the tradition of the ready-made. And the most famous ready-made in history is Duchamp's urinal, commonly known as the fountain, and that is also in the collection and shows really the history of how artists have brought objects from the real world, objects that have nothing to do with the history of art, into the gallery, and by moving them from outside the world into the gallery, they gain object status, art world status. Also, in an adjacent room, is a fantastic piece by Magdalena Abakanowicz, another work by that Polish artist, which shows the interest in the 20th century of the way artists, really from the early 1910s onwards, began to take materials from the real world, beginning with newspaper and trash, and incorporate them into works of art. I'm just going to, I wonder whether we can, this is a video, I wonder whether it can be made to work.
I'm Sheila Gowda, artist. I live in Bangalore, in South India. I started out as a painter, but now I work with sculptural installations and also painting, but in a very different way. I am constantly kind of observing, and you observe from a personal point of view, you observe from finding something that's new or surprising, and not everything that you find becomes material for a work. But there is a moment when an idea and a material comes together. I think it's all the more relevant at this point in India to do what I'm doing. Things are changing really quickly. But I don't think what's happening now is necessarily positive. In fact, we are going backwards in many ways.
So we'll stop the PowerPoint there. I just wanted to show you that because I think one of the really challenging things and interesting things in a museum like Tate Modern is how do you help an audience and your visitors understand and appreciate and enjoy works of art from very different cultural backgrounds. And so we have a program of working with our video team who traveled to Bangalore and met with Sheila Gowda and made this beautiful little film that speaks so eloquently of the context of her work. And the ambition is to do that for many of the living artists in the collection.
Thank you, Francis. And taking off from how Sheila Gowda ended, that we're going backwards, but so refreshing to see that the Tate is actually becoming more inclusive. Do you feel that that vision and that intention now for you institutionally is compromised by the alt-right backlash, by the whole Brexit move? How do you see it impacting you institutionally? Could there be political issues involved? Do you have, people who object to your art walking in and saying, you can't do this kind of art? We have that happening to us here, I have to tell you. So we're interested in understanding how it works there.
Well, it's a very good question. I think we feel that it's incredibly important, given the context of the kind of neoliberal Brexit situation, that we have to make a strong stand and articulate our belief and the belief of artists in creative freedom, in a space of dialogue and openness, and therefore the very international hang that we have, where for kind of metaphorically you can walk from Delhi to Denmark without a visa, or you can travel to China, without regulation. It's incredibly important that Tate remains a place like that. But equally, because the Brexit vote represents almost half the UK, that there's a huge population who feels very disenfranchised, very depressed, very angry with what is happening in the world. It's very important that we become a place that allows those people to be part of the dialogue as well. So Museum Tate have to behave as public spaces, and public spaces are places for debate, not just for one narrative. And as a result of that, what is happening is that we have found that people come to Tate to demonstrate. Social media will take a picture and put it up anywhere, and Tate Modern is a great background to make your demonstration, either for the right or for the left.
Right. But do you see that these audiences, are you changing the way you present the art? For example, you have said that that painting is important, and that the history of art before the 20th century was all about painting, and that we can't ignore that either, and that you think that do you think there might be a kind of resurgence in painting and in the more traditional ways of presenting because you have to address this constituency, or do you feel confident that you might be able to co-opt this constituency to your way of thinking?
It's the co-opting, and I think the biggest impediment to audiences participating is fear of incomprehension. People don't like to feel stupid. They don't like to be talked down to. And so what we're trying to do is ensure that we do everything we can to stop people feeling stupid. And so we have been incredibly careful to rewrite all our museum texts in a way that is not dumbing down, but does not require a specialist language to understand them. So we've taken out most of the art historical technical terms, or we explain them. We're trying to provide, where possible, materials that will help people gain an insight, whether it's an artist speaking, or it's some documentation of the period or the place where the art was made. And we have, in particular, a single gallery now, a group of galleries called the Start Galleries. And they're galleries to welcome audiences who might never have been to a museum before, where in the galleries, in a very, very light-hearted way, it's not heavy, the label is just, you can gain an understanding of the kind of systems and conventions at play in a museum.
Francis, the new Switch House Tate cost 260 million. And when you were in India and you hear those kind of staggering figures, one wonders, and it's not just the Tate Modern, but this sort of spectacular architecture, these star architects, and these incredible buildings have become the sort of norm for museums. And when you look at the rest of the world and you see how deprived they are, do you think that kind of architecture and that kind of vision for the museum as an institution is sustainable into the future?
Well, looking ahead, I wonder whether Tate Modern mightn't be one of the last great new buildings. It is a great new building, and we love it and will use it. But I think looking forward in terms of our program and other museums' programs, we're all becoming much more interested in what people do in museums. Is it a useful space? Is it a social space? How does it relate to making? And moving away from the idea of the spectacular display of a collection. So although I warmly welcome our new building, interestingly, if you do visit us, as much space is taken in our new building for those kind of social and learning activities as it is for the space of art. And I just want to add one thing to that. Of course, the world is a very deprived place, and philanthropy is always needed for social projects and health and education in many needy parts of the world. But art is also incredibly important in those places too, because art is the one place where people of all classes and genders and ages can engage in a way that disengages them from their social context, because it is about the life of the imagination and the intellect.
Speaking about gender, you have actually championed women artists. Your three major shows were on Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, and Agnes Martin. And you've said that there is as much a bias against women in the art world as there is in the world around. And you've broken that bias by reaching the top. Can you tell us a little bit about how that bias works? Is it that it's just much more difficult for women? How do women overcome that bias? Do you have to become more like a man? You know, addressing the theme of this Litfest as well. Do you think you've had to change as a person just to deal with that very manly world?
Well, I think there's no single answer to that question, but I do think we, all of us, whether in India, Asia, or in Europe, live in a very gendered world, and the gendering begins on day one of our lives. So we are brought up as children, as girls and boys, in very different ways. And you know, I think it's very dangerous to talk about stereotypical gender behaviors, but our destinies are to a degree predetermined. I think I would advocate a feminizing of the world rather than women becoming more manly. And I think slowly that is what is happening. A small detail from Tate's recent history, and I know this causes amusement, but all my colleagues now receive bias training. And it's a really interesting piece of training because it teaches you, me, Nick Sirota, my colleagues, not to prejudge people according to their gender, their race, their level of education, their economic status. And those biases are the biases that currently regulate the world.
And so will that result in your integrating more women artists? Do you think that or is that not a consideration for you?
Well, I'm unashamedly a believer in positive discrimination because I don't see how we otherwise redress the balance. Right. You know, we have agency, we can take action.
Right. You've also said that vested interests operate in the art world and that they are delaying social change. Can you elaborate a little bit in terms of what that's one of the comments that I read in one of your interviews, that there are vested interests in the art world and they're delaying social change.
Okay, so I think what I was probably talking about in that, when I was quoted in that article, was really about the relationship between the marketplace and the art world, or the role of the marketplace within the art world. As soon as visual arts are more regulated by economy, the economy of the market, than any other area of cultural practice. And it's interesting that we are here with a literary festival. And you can buy a book. How much does a book cost? It's cheap. Hundreds of thousands of people can buy books, and it's a fantastic way of distributing culture. Works of art operate within a marketplace which is very unregulated and controlled by essentially a few very wealthy people and a network of galleries. And one of the things I find interesting is that the art world that I'm interested in is not necessarily exactly the same art world that the market is interested in. And so the challenge is, how do you disassociate value, aesthetic value, social value, value to the audience, from economic value? And I think what is happening at the moment is that there's an increasing divergence in the marketplace, so the big commercial galleries in New York, the auction houses, and actually the art that we want to see in museums. So much of the art that we have on display in our museum is not art that you could buy in the marketplace, and it might come direct from the artist or from a local network.
But doesn't that present a challenge for you when you have to raise funds for exhibitions which are, have such high insurance rates? And I mean, it's certainly one of the issues that we have here, that then you have to go out to the marketplace and raise funds. And so there is that sort of tension, that dichotomy that exists in.
Well, the challenge is to persuade the people who have the money that what we're doing is as or equally or more important than what they might be at first state interested in. And in order to do that, we have to speak with absolute authority and confidence and have research behind us. It's why we put so much effort into research networks, is so that we can be very secure that we can tell our public that Bernard Mukherjee is just as important as Henri Matisse, even though he might not be well served by the marketplace.
Yes, Frances has said, again in one of her interviews, that the Tate Modern is a university with a playground attached. I love that. I think that is terrific. It's certainly very much the vision that I have for the Bauda Gilad Museum, because we, as you know, that kind of spectacular architecture in India is difficult. I think it might come. We had a competition to build a new extension, and we have Stephen Hall, who won the competition. We had a lot of the star architects. So it might be, I mean, that iconic building does help to draw audiences, but I think that definition of how a museum would evolve in the future as a university, as a center for research and cultural exchange is I think, an important way of defining it. And that change, I think very much a change, moving away from these spectacular shows.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that the spectacular building is a terrific draw for audiences, particularly tourist audiences. And we do have a large tourist audience in London. It's really important to our economy. But the reason I want the playground is because with a collection like the Tate, which is a public collection, it's owned by the nation, the really important audience is the nation. And it is the children of the nation who will grow up into being cultured, articulate human beings, and our future depends on them. So the idea of the playground is to try and encourage young people, particularly from the local area, which is very diverse, to be comfortable and at ease in the museum.
Frances, when you think about reaching out to the world, because that seems to be very much your vision, how do you think we might be able to address this imbalance where we are unable to show modern and contemporary art, or for that matter, much of the art in the West, because the cost of insurance is so high, it's prohibitive travel expense. And also, there are anxieties about infrastructure, etc. Do you think that as we go forward, that the digital medium might be able to play a role in that? Do you feel that, certainly India and Mr. Modi are very, as you can see with demonetization, very, very determined to make India a digital country? You think that might impact the art world? How do you see it impacting the art world?
Well, I think the digital space is already a really interesting space as a space for commentary and debate and information.
But for exhibition?
But for exhibition, until I see artists working very compellingly in that space, I'm not yet convinced that the digital experience of an exhibition will be anything like the physical experience. And there is something wonderful still in this day about the aura of real objects, whether they're objects from the real world or from the world of art. For me, coming to Mumbai and spending a couple of days in the streets, in the shops, in the galleries, and driving around, the vividness of the physical experience is miles, millions of miles away from the possible experience that one might have digitally. I don't think that digital will ever replace the physical in that sense. But I do think it's possible, as artists begin to work in different ways, that artists will be physically present here and can make work here, and that will send work here. You have an amazing community of artists in this country. And I'm here on a short visit, and they're not visible. So why don't we start with showing great Indian artists?
Which we do. We try to do, but at least at the Bauda Gilad we do. And there, in Mumbai there is a dearth, but, well, even in Delhi, really. I think KNMA is the only other space that shows contemporary artists quite. Now the National Gallery of Modern Art has started, but for the longest time the National Gallery of Modern Art had a modernist agenda. To come back to Indian art and the how it is received, because of course India and the UK have a very special relationship. We were one country at one time. Do you think the old prejudices were in play when your very well-known and successful Bhupen Khakkar show, You Can't Please All, was presented? Because there were quite a few critics who, one in particular, but there were some of the others as well, who just didn't get it in a sense.
Well, I think, yes.
Is that still operates? And are you therefore, is that going to constrain your showing more Indian art?
I think it's not just a problem for Indian art. It's interesting that much of the art that we've shown from India, the Middle East and Africa and South America to a degree is considered by a particular generation of critics as a response to or a legacy of something that happened in the West.
Right.
So Bhupen Khakkar is seen as a kind of Johnny-come-lately or an after-ran. And what they find, if they could read the catalogue and find out, or they could look at the paintings and see that he is a highly sophisticated,
Absolutely.
rather brilliant individual
Absolutely.
that is able to absorb and take influences where he decides what's relevant to him to make art that relates to his life and his experience living between India and the UK. And I have huge admiration for Bhupen Khakkar because I think, like a number of other artists, I'm thinking about the Sudanese modernist El Salahi, for example, who found the modern not by copying but by kind of cannibalism. He absorbed what he wanted and created something very fresh and new. And it's a kind of, it's a kind of old-fashioned hang-up of critics who cannot believe that there were other ways of being modern in the world.
Right, right. So taking off from that, do you think that, what would your advice to Indian museums be? I mean, how would you like to, or let me put it this way, how would you like to see Indian museums change when you come here? How can we, because museums in the West are so successful.
But it's such a problem, Tasneem, because your museum, for example, is one of my favorite museums in the world. Then in Calcutta, you have arguably the world's most wonderful museum, the India Museum. Please don't change them.
But that is museumizing the museum in a sense.
India has to evolve. India has to evolve a template that works for India. And I think as the world gets more and more alike, it's incredibly important that places stay as different to each other as possible. So I would personally be horrified to find a Herzog and de Meuron designed Museum of Modern Art in Mumbai or Delhi.
Oh, well, we're going to have Stephen Hall.
But I think
he's done it very sensitively.
But there is a way of evolving
Yes.
a contemporary museum that speaks of India and of India's past, but that faces the contemporary world. And there will be some great curators who invent that model for India.
Yes, I think we've tried to do that to some extent at the Bauda Jilat Museum. So
I think you have. I mean, I think the way you work, extraordinary historical collection, speaks of a colonial past and a reality of this place, but the way you work with contemporary artists is fantastic.
Yes, thank you. And so do you do scenario planning for the Tate? If you were to look at what the Tate will be, given how many technological advances are taking place, given how everything is so sort of up in the air at this moment in time, so much. When you read the newspapers and you read about the potential of change that is going to happen, how do you see that impacting the Tate? Do you do that 20-year scenario planning?
Well, I'm doing a sort of 10-year scenario planning exercise at the moment, and I think we do see the future in the way people use the museum as much, if not more, than the content the museum has. So I think there's a tremendous appetite for the museum becoming a useful space, a place where people come to make things and talk about things and meet their friends and spend time. And one of the reasons for that is that in London, like many cities, public space is getting scarcer and scarcer. The parks are disappearing, the libraries are closing, real estate is getting more expensive. So places where people can meet and spend time are beginning to be the shopping centre or the museum. Right. So the museum is a cultural public space where people can spend time and learn in a very informal and social way is more and more important.
I think that's a very good point at which we can open it up to the audience now. Are there questions for Francis? Or for me? Mm-hmm. Please, can you identify yourself and let us know what you do a little bit?
Hello. Hi, my name is Sumit Shetty. Thank you for that delightful conversation. My question is about one of the eternal mysteries of art, which is how art is priced. What is the fair value for a work of art? And I'd like to know, if you're acquiring a work for the Tate Modern, how does the head of acquisitions decide whether a work of art is worth the list price? And does being the Tate Modern give you an unfair advantage over all of us because artists are dying to have their work exhibited there? Thank you.
It's such a good question, and I have no idea how to answer it because I'm not sure what a fair price is, because it's so random, the marketplace, and so mercurial that, an artist like Ana Lupaș from Romania, I hate the word masterpiece, but it is a masterful work, fills a whole room, and the price is a fraction of what a painting by an American artist, a third of her age, would be in Gagosian in New York. So the market is a kind of mad thing, and a market is for investors, and it's like real estate. So the fair price reflects the artist's contribution and what they feel they need from the work, and what we can pay. And when there isn't a marketplace, that's a conversation and a negotiation. Interestingly, you would have thought that as a museum you get a good deal. In fact, you don't get a great deal. People assume that museums have big resources and deep pockets, even though they don't. And a lot is at stake when selling to the museum. So I don't think we benefit hugely from discounts, but we do benefit from artists, particularly older artists, who want in their declining years to make sure that their legacy is assured. And that's always an interesting time to talk to an artist when they've made all their money, lived their life, but now they're thinking, how do they want to be remembered? So we have this expression we use, which is called ambulance chasing. And it's, the conversation that happens when an artist is not going to be around for very long. And very often artists are hugely generous as they get older because they finally think they want a legacy. But in terms of the marketplace, we have to often wrestle with the intermediaries, so dealers representing artists, and the dealers obviously have a business. So we're working in very different economic environments.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Sandeep. I'm starting my own art collection and exhibition series. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out?
Again, a very good question. What advice would I give you? Trust your inner judgment. Don't do anything anybody tells you to do. You need to follow your nose and develop your own style. I think that when you look at the great collectors and the great dealers, They're dealers who early on had a particular belief and passion and kind of taste for kind of a small, you know, they had style and they had distinction. So don't try and do everything. Build up real knowledge and commitment to a small number of things and make your name by association with that particular thing.
Yes, I think that's very important. It's knowledge, and you're absolutely right, because in the earlier years, dealers were very often fighting the market, in fact, to sustain and support artists. Today, most of the dealers are interested just in the value of the artist, you know. Unfortunately, the environment has changed. So you should absolutely, you know, go with your instinct, but it's important to engage with the artists. If you're making an Indian collection, many of the Indian artists are available. You should meet with them, see who really moves you. I think that really is where it's at. Yeah.
I'm just going to add one thing to that, because I think it's really important for collectors, and I mean museums too, once you start collecting an artist, try and stick with them. Because artists go through thick and thin and they have ups and downs, but it's really interesting to represent artists over the course of their career. So a smaller number of artists, and then really support them. You can have a big impact on their fortunes too.
They can have a big impact on yours. Are there any other questions? Yes, there's one there at the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lina. I'm an economist in the week, and then I'm an art history student at the Baghdad Gilad at the weekends. Something that struck me is that even in India, there's a lot of art we don't see. We don't see a lot of art from tribal areas or from rural or from parts that aren't necessarily the big cities. So you talked about inclusion earlier. Could you talk a little more about how you made sure that your collection, the way you look at art in the contemporary space, is more inclusive?
Well, okay, so...
That's addressed to Francis, right? Yes, yes, okay.
Well, two things. In relation to British art, and of course we are both the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, but also the National Gallery of British Art, we have a commitment to representing British art of all dimensions. And by that I mean both the kind of strong presence of urban artists, but also artists practicing throughout the United Kingdom. And we have a very strong curatorial commitment to do that. In relation to more international art, the only way that we can ensure that we acquire art beyond the famous names in the marketplace is to do as much ground research as we can. So, for example, before we acquire work in Eastern Europe, we've only really acquired work from Romania and from Poland and from Russia to date, because we've been focusing all our energies in spending time in those countries doing real research. And that's the only way you get to see things that are more grounded, is by talking to artists and saying, you know, talk to young artists. Who are the artists who taught you? Who are the artists from your hometown that you looked at? And then talking to teachers, saying, who are the young people that you admire? So really, we work through, in a way, networks of artists. One thing leads to another.
But that's a very good question, because I think we need to address the issue in India as well, and that hasn't been addressed. We're still following a paradigm that is in a sense been received. And there are colonial ways of interpreting, which it's not just colonial, it's also a very modernist way of interpreting, which actually segregates and separates, rather than integrating art as it might have been many centuries earlier. Art was just, you know, no one in India really thought that this is design, or this is decorative art, or this is painting. It was all, or this is architecture. It was all very much part of the whole work of art. I think we are slowly moving in that direction. But the unfortunate part is that there aren't sufficient institutions that are taking up the challenge and attempting to redress the balance in a sense. The Crafts Museum tried to do it, but then again it went under the rubric of craft, and that again isolates it. I think we do, you're absolutely right. I think we do need to revisit that, we do need to relook at it, and I think as we go forward and as we become, you know, as we want to become more inclusive, as you said, we need to address those issues and make sure that those kind of artists, simply because they don't put a signature, though they have become very smart now and they are also putting signatures on their work of art, that they're also given a space. But the idea is, are they addressing, I think the important thing with contemporary is it something that is provocative, and is there an idea? It's not just a rhetorical way of reproducing what went before.
Yes, I mean, just to add to that, the three of the artists that I showed you Mandela Abakanovic, Lenore Tawney, and Marina Mukherjee are artists who 20 years ago would have been defined as fiber artists or craft workers, and they would have been seen as not appropriate for a museum of modern art. So it seems like a small step, but to be able to encounter those practices in the museum is not an embrace of craft, but it demonstrates the way artists have co-opted craft techniques.
Absolutely, and the idea, I mentioned this to Francis, that more and more, just the process of making in itself is a way of defining art. Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Gayatri. So, modern contemporary art faces a lot of criticism. So, in that context, what do you think makes art? What is art? Both of you. This is for both of you.
So you have to come to our session. We're almost out of time, and we have a session tomorrow, and we'd love to see all of you there. It's called But Is This Art? And we have, of course, Francis. We have Dayanita Singh, who's here with us today, very well-known artist and photographer, whose exhibition will be opening on the 10th at the Bhaudadilad Museum, and Shudhabrata Sengupta of the Raqs Media Collective, a wonderful speaker, writer, an artist. And I hope all of you will come tomorrow for that session. So we will address that very interesting question tomorrow.
I'm really worried about that session.
Good evening, my name is Mona Mehta. What I wanted to know was what role would the museum be able to play? As she said rightly, that awareness, but what about re-educating the public and decoding art?
That's tomorrow's session. How do we decode the art for the public?
No, but would
Come tomorrow.
No, would it stay, I'm not talking of just the adults. I'm talking of a younger generation or inclusive in schools and colleges where you just don't have the artsy type or something where it is not compartmentalized, where they could at least appreciate art if they are not even artists.
I think the curriculum for schools is it's incredibly important that art is at the centre of that. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, and we're trying to do at Tate, is campaign for arts education or education through art to be central to the core curriculum through primary schools and secondary schools in the UK. And if we don't do that, and if we don't make art part of every child's education, we in museums do not have much of a future. It's incredibly important. And I don't think we should underestimate the significance of that kind of creative education on all forms of attainment, whether it's in new technologies or, any form of intellectual engagement needs creative thinking.
Could you enlighten us about the Indian scene in that?
I'm afraid we're running out of time, and there's another. So I think everybody can have just one question. We're almost out of time. Yeah, there's another question here.
You brought up the point that there would be no museums, but more important than that is that art is an intrinsic part of each person's life. So I don't think the museum would go, because I've seen, with little children, the only major way of expression is through art. You cannot find out what a child is feeling or thinking, but when they start painting, you know where their subconscious is.
I agree.
And that's most important. So I think that comes first, and the rest follows. You know?
I hope so.
Yeah.
So thank you, Francis. That's been a wonderful
Thank you.
exchange.
Thank you for coming.
And thank you to all of you.